Homelessness, racial injustice, hunger, economic disparity. Join an ISBA Conversation. Real change begins with you. Sponsored by Let's Talk Arizona.
Salam, shalom, and peace. I'm Azra Hussain, president and co-founder of the Islamic Speakers Bureau of Arizona. My co-hosts are John Linder, senior rabbi of Temple Salel in Fountain Hills, and Pastor David Felten of the Fountains United Methodist Church. You're joining us tonight for an ISBA Conversation. Real change begins with you. The consequences of systemic racism. Welcome, John and David.
Great to be here.
Salam.
So, John, you want to start us off?
Sure. Well, I know that we're speaking about systemic racism, and for each of us, as we are facilitating this panel, just to relate with our own circumstances. So, as a Jew, we are certainly no strangers to anti-Semitism that actually has gone up dramatically over the last few years. So you can draw your own conclusions as to why that's the case. But actually, in a culture of division and looking for scapegoats, the Jews certainly have been in the sights for that, as it is today. So this is not just something in the history books. It's sadly alive and well.
Yeah.
And Azra, how about you about systemic racism, systemic injustice with Muslims?
I think, the same as what John just said. Muslims have been experiencing it more and more in the recent past, but for decades now, it has been the case for Muslims as well, not just in America but around the world. But here it is difficult because just like many minorities in this country, Muslims also face racism in the form of not having equal opportunities. Teachers not necessarily treating you the same, which is kind of sad. You'd think even if your peers, your fellow students behaved a certain way, at least you could depend on your teacher. But it seems that even teachers are just human beings sometimes and fall into the narrative that's out there and mistreat young children in their classrooms. And that's happened in Arizona. A couple of years ago, we had to deal with young middle and high school students who actually dealt with that. In fact, one elementary school age child as well. So yeah, Muslims do experience that as well. And David, you want to talk to that just a little?
I'll talk to the oppression of the middle class, middle-aged white male in America. One of the things that I wanted to make sure to bring up is that one of our panelists tonight is an acquaintance of mine from having done some work up on the Navajo Nation. His name's Silver Nez Perry. He's one of the liaisons with our Sierra Service Project mission group that we work with each summer. And we're thrilled to have him be a part of our panel. However, it's been virtually impossible to get him connected with us via the internet. And that in part is one of the things we're talking about, is the kind of systemic injustice that exists in our culture, just structurally, that it's so many of the infrastructure pieces that we take for granted, you can't take for granted on the Navajo Nation, be it water, be it electricity, be it internet, be it healthcare. It's just an amazing separation from what the rest of us take for granted. So if we're able to get Silver on the line with us, we will jump to him quickly to have him say a few words, because we want to take advantage of the moment that he does have internet. but he may not be able to stay on long enough to even participate. And I think that that just is anecdotally a perfect example of the kind of systemic injustice that we face and the lack of equality that we have across our culture. So,
Um, uh, Very true, David. Very true. He has said, Silva just wrote to us and said that he's lost all internet at this point, so he is still trying. Um, we're going to encourage every audience member, everyone who's signed in, everyone who's listening, to please post your questions, comments in the comment section, whether you're on YouTube or Facebook. Start doing it even now if you feel like it. Don't wait till the end. We welcome comments, we welcome questions. And with that, we would like to introduce all our guests.
Yeah. So I'm delighted, honored to introduce my friend, Pastor Miguel Gomez-Acosta, was born in Mexicali, Baja California, Mexico. In 1985, he immigrated to Salinas, California, where he was introduced to the Lutheran Church, the LCA. He lived in various places, including Guam and the Bay Area, before returning to Salinas, where he graduated high school. And this is jumping because of time, in 2016, Pastor Gomez-Acosta was called to be the director of evangelical mission for the Grand Canyon Synod. He is most importantly married to Rachel, has two children, Mariana, 17, Bradley, 14. Currently, he is a member of Holy Trinity in Chandler. Wonderful to be with you, Pastor.
Thank you, John, especially for the invitation to be with you here this evening. I look forward to the conversation.
and I'd like to take the opportunity to introduce one of my colleagues in the United Methodist Church, the Reverend Kimberly Scott. So excited that you could be with us tonight, Kim. Kim is kind of a celebrity here in local United Methodism. She's a second career pastor. Yeah, be shy. So Kim spent over 12 years as a high school guidance counselor, and she's also worked in the banking industry, so she has some experience there with systemic injustice from that perspective as well. Before she answered the call to go into the ministry, went to ILIF School of Theology, which is not as good as Boston University, but it's okay. And then Kimberly has just this summer been ordained as an elder in our Desert Southwest Conference of the United Methodist Church. Not only is she the first African-American woman that we have ordained as an elder in our conference, she's also married, lesbian, and so she is breaking all kinds of barriers and is able to speak to all kinds of different injustices and different challenges that she's had in her life. So really thrilled to have you with us, Kimberly, for so many reasons. Thanks.
Thank you, David. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. It's always a pleasure to be around you and to be around your spirit and just to be around the work that you're doing. So thank you.
Thank you. So I was at this point going to introduce Silver, but obviously he is not going to be with us for right now. Azra?
All right, well, I'm going to introduce Janice Shimokubo, who is a third-generation Japanese-American who was born and raised in Chicago and now lives in North Scottsdale. Prior to moving to Arizona 4 years ago, Janice held marketing and product management roles with Fortune 500 companies. Equally important to Janice was giving back to the community. She served on the board of directors of the YMCA, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, and the Center for Asian Pacific American Women. Janice is married and has one daughter who, as a Japanese, German, Italian, French, Scottish American, is a beautiful representation of our multicultural society. Welcome, Janice.
Thank you so much, Azra. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm honored to have this opportunity to participate in this conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us. So, Janice, I would like you, if you don't mind, to go ahead and actually, no, I'm sorry, John. You're going to invite Miguel to speak. Miguel, would you mind starting us off?
Certainly. Once again, thank you for the opportunity to be with you here. I'm really honored for this opportunity to be able to tell my story, and a story that is not so different from many Latinos within the Arizona and, of course, the United States. Like my introduction did say, I was born in Mexico, Mexicali, California, which is a border town, but then immigrated actually as an undocumented person to Salinas, California. If you don't know anything about Salinas, it is the lettuce capital of the world. And so my family and I actually worked the lettuce fields. So systemic racism was not, I mean, I grew up with within that context, not only being called racial slurs, within even the community of Salinas, especially when things got heated up when arguments, whatever, but just also police harassment and various other things while I was living there. And then when I moved around to various places, including Guam, and then also in the Bay Area, and again, just everything just kind of followed the same pattern. But then I actually ended up after high school. I moved to Washington State for two reasons. One, I was going to go to Lutheran Bible Institute of Seattle, as well as I was an Army reservist, and so I was stationed at Fort Lewis. And Washington, believe it or not, was a little bit of a safe haven. It was very different than California. I didn't feel the same kind of systemic racism that I felt before. I think people were a little more careful, but I know it exists because later I began to realize it. But in the little bubble that I was at in the small school, it just was not prevalent. But it became so very in your face and very clear that I was different when I moved down here to Arizona. When I was invited to come to be a pastor of a congregation here, that I began to when I arrived, it was right at the tail end. If you remember of that, as a Proposition 300 that tried to make it, a felony to help any person that was undocumented. If you remember those laws, if you were way back then, and so that really instilled in me a fear. Even as even though I was a citizen of the United States, a fear of being in this community, because at that time, if you recall, that was during the Gerard Powell days when he was doing sweeps and all these things, and he was putting roadblocks and stuff like that, and actually stopping people for it and asking them for their for identification and all these things. So there was even a time that when my daughter and I would drive around in Mesa, I drove with my passport and my daughter's birth certificate. Imagine that for a second, a U.S. citizen having to carry a passport and a birth certificate of your child because she looked just like me. And so it finally came to a moment when I said, you know what, enough is enough. I can't live this way. I can't live in this fear. And so right about 2007, 2008 was when I kind of found my own voice and said, no, I will not live in fear. I will not be intimidated this way. And so that's when I began to get really active in various ways. One of which is where I met Rabbi Linder with the Valley Interfaith Project, the community organizing. And actually, I was with Rabbi Linder and others of Valley Interfaith Project that we were involved in trying to fight SB 1070 and doing actions against that and various other activities throughout in that time period, which was really prevalent, especially legislation that was very anti-immigrant at that time. But even in places where you think that you'd be safe from racism, I was not safe. I remember the very first congregation that I served here, that the very first sermon that I gave in that congregation, that I remember going to the fellowship hall after, and not only being told by great little old ladies about how wonderful I didn't have accent, but also I remember being in conversation with one particular person in the middle of the hall, and as we were talking, this person just blurted out, "Oh yeah," she was talking. "Oh yeah, my neighbors are wetbacks," and she just kept talking, and I kind of paused because I hadn't heard that term in like ages, and I looked around. Nobody had blinked. Nobody had said anything. Nobody even noticed except the Mexican that was there, right? So I'm like, oh my gosh. And I was at that time, I was too naive, too young. I mean, as in my pastoral role and pastoral identity, I should have confronted it. And that's my advice to all. When we hear it and we experience those things, we need to confront it and correct it at that moment. Not wait for tomorrow, because tomorrow may not come, but today, at this very moment. And especially when we are able to be an ally to somebody who's actually being the one that's being intimidated, because in that way, we can find they can find their own voice, and they can begin to also speak for themselves and saying, that's not okay for you to call me that. And so anyway, so even in church, it was a very different experience moving to Arizona from Washington State. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Miguel. And Kim, I know you have similar experiences, and you've got kind of broad background both in public education and in banking, as well as in ministry. So give us a couple of examples of your experience over those different areas.
Yeah, so I want to back up and just say that although I grew up I moved to Las Vegas when I was 10. Until 10, I was in Biloxi, Mississippi. So I don't know a time in my life when that was not racism for me to contend with in some way. I was called an N-word by someone before I was 5 years old. So it's always been a part of my life, systemically and just in general. I think for me, when we moved to Las Vegas, because the racism was not so blatant, so in your face, right? I kind of got comfortable for a little while and thought maybe, hey, this is a different place. The world's different here. And then as soon as I started school, that next school year, I learned otherwise. As I was being bused 45 minutes every morning across town to a school across town, where as the kids who were being bused, we were definitely the ones that were, from the wrong side of the tracks. We were all black. And we were bused there to integrate the schools. And we often were the ones who got the brunt of the punishment, whenever anything went wrong. We were the ones who were often the targets. The boys especially were often the targets, and often being suspended just for, sometimes little infractions. And so after junior high, I went on to high school. In the school that I was at there, luckily I had a middle school teacher from the previous school who carried me under her wings and into high school and convinced me to get involved in student leadership. And that made a huge difference for me during my high school years. And it really allowed me to be a part of the student body in a way that I had not had a chance to be a part of the student body in middle school, because I had not cracked that glass ceiling, right? Even in middle school, of just being involved and things like that. So in high school was a time that I think I once again relaxed and was not so worried about racism. And I remember during my senior year, my favorite teacher, Jody Grant, she had put me in charge of creating our float for the Martin Luther King Day Junior Parade. And so she was like, okay, what theme are we going to do? And I go, I think we should build a globe and have kids all around it and say, we live in a colorblind society, and paint the kids all different colors. She says, Kim, if you are saying we live in a colorblind society and you want to put kids around the globe that are different colors, are you really saying that we're in a colorblind society? Wouldn't they be gray if we were colorblind? And she says, do you really believe that we live in a colorblind society? Or are you just saying that because you think that's what, you want us to hear? This woman, Jody Grant, knew a lot about me. She knew the side of town that I lived on. When the LA riots happened, she because the buses were not taking us back to my neighborhood, she drove me back to my neighborhood that night when there was, fires everywhere along town. And so she knew at that point that I was not being real. And so that kind of woke me up to the reality, although I was a popular kid and I was involved in all these things, when I began to look around, some of the kids who lived in my exact same neighborhood were not having the same experiences that I was having. I was having them because I had a teacher that was willing to get me involved in student leadership, had me with the top students who were all in IB classes, and although I wasn't, I was doing all the things they were doing, and I was also involved in the orchestra and sports. So I graduate high school and I go on to college, and within my first week, for the first time, I'm sitting in a football game in the small town of Susanville, California, and I was there because I was playing volleyball and softball. I had gotten some scholarships. And so I'm sitting there in the stands, and my roommate, actually one of the girls on my softball team said, "Oh, we should nickname you Hershey. You're so chocolate." And so they thought it was cool to begin to nickname me, to give me that nickname. And then my roommate, who was a girl that I had played softball with in Las Vegas, from the time we were 10 years old all the way throughout high school, she was trying to show, and she's white, she was trying to show off for the rest of our new teammates. And we were talking about something and she got upset with me and she goes, "You just need to go back to Africa." And before I knew it, my hand had slapped her across the face, because I had not heard something like that since I was a really, a small child, and so it has been always ongoing. I went to school in Northern California. So I was in Susanville in Lassen County for 2 years, which is a very rural area. The only thing it's really known for now is a federal prison. And so most of the black families that lived in that town were because they were there because their loved ones were in that particular prison. But then I went up to Humboldt State University. I was recruited there to play softball. And on my first meeting with the coach who had recruited me, I sit down to have breakfast with him, and he says, "Oh, Scott, I didn't know you were black." And he went on to say, "Over the phone, you didn't sound like you were black. You didn't have, and I was stunned. I didn't know what to do." And that mentality really went on to affect my entire softball career. From that time on, and he would often say things to my teammates, basically letting me know he did not want me to be on the team. And when we took our first trip out of town, he left me home, even after I had a great game, the last time before. And then from that time, he just began excluding me from the team and saying things to my teammates who would bring things back to me. He just had a dislike for me because I was black and also because I was also openly lesbian at the time. So it's been a myriad of things that I've experienced. When I got back, I became a school counselor at the same high school that I graduated from, and all my teachers were still there. And actually, they wanted me to work there. They wanted me to be at Valley High School because I had a legacy that I left behind. But once I got to be a school counselor, and I was educated well enough to know. And I went to Cal State Long Beach for my first master's in counseling. But I was educated well enough to realize that when I was at Valley High School as a student, that I wasn't given the best education that I could have gotten. I wasn't aware that there were AP classes and IB classes that could have better prepared me for college, probably could have gotten me into some four-year schools on some scholarships because I was a good student, but I was not taking the honors classes. So I realized, once I became a school counselor, there was so much that I was lacking. But also what it helped me to do was it helped me to really be there for my students of color. Because by the time I got back to Valley High School, we were 80% Latino school. We still had our IB program and a very good AP program. However, the majority of the neighborhood kids were Latino, and we had some blacks and some refugees also from other places that were there. So, but it allowed me, just my experiences allowed me to make sure that I did for them what did not happen for me in terms of getting the right courses, getting counseling for careers and going on to college. And so within my first 2 or 3 years there as a counselor there and then becoming the college counselor, I broke records in terms of how many scholarship dollars our school was able to collect for students. And it wasn't because I was solely focused on the poor kids and the brown and black kids, but I was focused on all students. But I was making sure that our black and Latino students knew, and Filipino and all the others knew what they needed to do. And I was giving them the right coursework and the right tools to be able to do so. So my way of fighting racism has always been to somehow beat the system, right? I am the first in my family to graduate from college, to get a bachelor's degree. My first nephew, who just graduated 2 years ago. So it took 3 generations for a black man in my family to have a college degree. And, ironically, now I'm working on my 4th master's degree, and I'm aspiring to get my PhD. Because for me, although systemically my income my income has been impacted by racism in different ways, keeping me from going through the, the glass ceiling was always an issue. But I have been able to raise myself up in other ways, in ways that are breaking barriers has been more important to me. So as I've broken this barrier, there's more barriers that I want to break for others. And that's just my mentality. That's just who I am, because I don't have a choice to fail. And I don't think many Black women have a choice to fail, which is why we are high achieving. And so what racism has done for for a lot of African American women is that it has made us high achievers. We've known that we have to work 110% harder than everyone else and still continue to work to get just what we need. So.
Thanks, Kim. That's fantastic. And we'll come back because I want to hear about your experience with redlining as one of the examples of systemic injustice. So we'll come back to that, and we'll pass it on to Janice to share a little bit about her experience.
Sure. So I'm going to take sort of the broader view of the Asian American community and then come down to my personal experiences. But, the consequences of systemic racism are like screaming right now for the Asian American community. With the COVID-19, the increase of hate crimes against Asian Americans has just skyrocketed. And as early as March, several of us in the community were contacted by the FBI because that early on, they were already noticing some of these inflammation of hate crimes across the country. It's not just in the coastal cities, but it's in Middle America, it's everywhere. And so there are a new group that started out that's Stop AAPI Hate. The Anti-Defamation League is tracking it as well. And so it's just something that has just surfaced with a vengeance over the last 4 to 5 months. And I was thinking about that, thinking, okay, so for the Asian American community, it's a little bit different in the sense like it feels like it's quiet, and then something boom happens. And so I thought, well, what else has happened? And so go back for 40 years. So it feels like maybe this is the locust or something. But in the early 1980s, there was the case of Vincent Chin in Detroit. And the story there was that, think about the early 1980s when the Japanese automakers were really gaining traction and really starting to take market share. And Detroit in particular was really hard hit with, the automobile industry. And so in Detroit, there was this Chinese American, 23-year-old, I believe, Vincent Chin, was out at a bachelor's party and got beaten up by 2 white men, automotive men, and died, was killed. And they thought he was Japanese. So they went after him and killed him. And what happened there was very similar to what we're hearing today, and well, it's always gone on. But the initial sentence for these 2 men was just, I think it was 2nd-degree murder, and then it was reduced to manslaughter, and then they had $3,000 fines and no prison sentence. So, I mean, just horrible situation. And that's when the Asian American community really started to gather steam and start to take some action. And through some civil lawsuits, they were able to get at least these 2 perpetrators to pay back financially to the Chin family. So that was the 80s. And then go back even 40 years, and then there's World War II. And I'm of Japanese ancestry, as Azra told you. And that was a time when the fear in the United States obviously was horrendous, and Japan was the major enemy, and Japanese people were easy to identify, right, because we looked different. And so 120,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans were sent to internment camps. And my parents and my grandparents were sent. And it's a really horrible, sad story because I think 2/3 of the people in the camps were American citizens. They were born here, but that didn't matter. They were thrown into the camp. And so these families, and my grandparents, for example, owned a house, and they owned a little 5 and 10 store, they called it. And they had 2 weeks basically to sell everything because they had to pack up, put everything into two suitcases per person, and they were shipped out. So my dad, they were not married at the time. My dad was sent to Arkansas, and my mom and her family were sent to Northern California, Tule Lake, which is at the Oregon border. And so they were incarcerated from 1942 to 1946. Some were allowed to leave early. But bottom line is, I mean, this was the systemic racism raging at the time. And so my story is related to that internment because as a child, my grandparents or parents would not talk about it at all. I mean, and they had friends who were Japanese and they would use code words like, Owen Camp, but they would not talk about it. They were so ashamed and hurt and really traumatized. In retrospect, I think they were traumatized. But as I told Azra earlier too, so we were told do not speak Japanese. So I don't know very much Japanese. I wish I did. And we were told to study hard. You do better than everybody else. Keep your head down. Don't rock the boat. Just be white kind of thing. Or maybe if you're quiet, nobody will notice you're around. So that's another thing that if you notice around the country, there are Chinatowns in many cities, but there aren't any Japanese towns because that was the other thing from the camp experiences. Like when these Japanese were released, Japanese Americans, for example, my mother, who was not married to my father at the time, moved to Chicago from California because didn't want to have anything to do with it. And so they didn't want to live near other Japanese people really because then they might be found. So it's just like a very, again, it's hard to describe, but it sort of made me who I was. But obviously growing up, I knew I was different, and so it was always pounded into me that you have to get a good education because nobody can take that away from you. I mean, that was, again, part of the vestiges of the internment. Your stuff can be taken away, but your education is with you forever. So lessons like that. And so we grew up in a white neighborhood. And so I kind of, as I said, I knew I was different. But it wasn't until I got into college where I really started to realize, okay, this is not normal, right? And so for me, it's been a lot of unlearning of things and speaking up and realizing that, a lot of us are painted as foreigners forever. Like, so for example, Chinese people arrived in the US in the 1850s, starting in the 1850s. That's 170 years ago. So these, we are like 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th generation, but still people looking at us think, oh, well, you must probably be from somewhere else. Because periodically I would get those questions, even at work, because I worked in Fortune 500 companies, people saying things like Kimberly heard, oh, you speak really great English. Or, they talk to me on the phone and then they meet me and they go, oh, like, oh my gosh. But so there's things like that went on. And I just learned that I had to somehow teach people in my own way, who I am. And that's the hardest part, I think, for Asian Americans is we are so stereotyped, model minority. And that might sound great, but really it's not. But if you don't want to be an engineer or a doctor, or maybe you're not great at math. So it's that model minority stereotype. It's, oh, you don't need money. And that's not true because there's a big segment of Asian Americans who are economically deprived. So it's a learning and an unmasking and a whole process to bring all this to light. And so here I am today, much wiser. My eyes are much wide open, and that's what I experienced. And there's a lot more too.
Wow.
Janice, I just want to interject a little bit of Arizona trivia because as an Arizona native, this is not something I learned about until I was in later adulthood, which is, do you know what the third and fourth largest cities were in Arizona during World
Probably
War II?
Poston and Gila River and Poston, probably.
Exactly. Yeah.
Because there were
Boston
8 to 10,000 people in the camp.
That's right.
It's like a town.
Wow.
Yeah.
And what's another interesting bit is Poston was Del Webb's first master planned community. So that's a little bit of interesting systemic advantage that Del Webb got from the government by being paid to build a Japanese internment camp. And now we've got Sun City and all these other places. So there are certain advantages that the white dude has. So
may I just
John.
add one other thing? Oh, may I just add one other thing about the camps? Because I had heard this about Gila River, because that was one of the camps as well, and that's on the reservation, on native land. And what I had heard was that when they internment camp, they'd been told for years and years and years that they couldn't get electricity. It just wasn't possible. And then when the internment camp was built, so imagine this 8,000 people camp, barbed wire, they had electricity.
Wow.
And so, you know, the natives are like, what the heck? They have electricity. So it was a blessing and the curse in the sense they were ultimately got electricity because they saw that the internment camp had it. Anyway, so it's just a complicated stories.
Thank you, Janice. You know, and that actually just speaks to what Silva's going through right now, right? He still doesn't have the kind of bandwidth to be able to connect to us even now. We have a couple of comments in the comment section. Somebody just mentioned, they said, hold on. Actually, I moved away from that one. He changed it to a different question. It seems to me that anti-Semitism and Islamophobia and anything that dehumanizes the other is evil. John?
Sure. I mean, I think this is as old as our respective ancient sacred texts are, that we are tribal, and when we are afraid of somebody else, we dehumanize them. And it's also, I think, what's remarkable, and Kimberly, I see you just this resonating. It's remarkable about our respective faith traditions, common ground and respective, that's what it's all about. That no, sorry about that. That person is also created in the image of God. Sorry about it. That Janice, you might expect that Janice is going to speak differently. And I was thinking, Kimberly, that Janice would have been great if she would have been with you with your softball coach. You would have flipped him out double. So it's just it is just the unfortunate dark side of humanity. But I think that's why we're here.
Yes. Amen.
It's true.
Amen.
It's true.
Well, we have another question that came through as well about people that deny white privilege. I mean, nearly everyone seems to want to deny white privilege if they've benefited from it themselves as white folks. So maybe we could have a round robin with our panelists to discuss your experiences of white privilege being what? That's not privilege.
Yeah, I actually had a couple of comments on that one. I had a lady that was, that I used to work with, and she walked up to me one day and she said, "What is the?" And she's white, and she goes, "What is this white privilege, and where can I get some?" And I stood there looking at her, thinking, "Wow, you have no idea." And it baffled me. It completely baffled me. And the second thing was, more than the white privilege thing, and actually it's this, a couple of days ago in Florida, a couple, a biracial couple, black woman married to a white man, were trying to get their house appraised. and this is in the news, you guys can read this anywhere, trying to get the house appraised. It came in at a certain, about almost $100,000 less than they were expecting. And the wife and husband discussed this and said, this is ridiculous. We're going to get it reappraised. But before they got it reappraised, they went through and de-blacknessified their home. They took away all symbols of being a black family, any kind of books, any kind of art, any kind of family pictures, and then they had it reassessed. It came in at $135,000 more.
Wow.
And so that speaks to what we're talking about right now. So that to me is stunning that we live in this
Kimberly,
day and
maybe-
time and it's still there.
Kimberly, maybe you could say a word about your experience with redlining, which ties in with that.
Yeah. And I guess, I didn't know it was a thing, I guess, until I moved to Las Vegas, right? And we were in this segregated enclave, and it was just kind of bizarre to me. In Mississippi, we didn't have any specific neighborhoods. People just lived kind of where they lived. But it was very different in Las Vegas. But the thing that has always drove me crazy is that in terms of property values, the way that redlining affects property values, right? So the redlining has happened to make sure that blacks only live in one part of town, right? But the consequences of that is that our property values are never equal to what those would be in a neighborhood that's not in the red line district area. And so oftentimes it's harder to get loans. And if you do get approved for a loan, your interest rate is going to be a lot higher, and just on and on. It's just harder to sell. So I guess and so what it does is that after a while for me, I began to recognize how much we were not valued in the U.S. In this country as Black people. If we can live in one neighborhood, and regardless of how the houses look, if you go up 2 blocks over to the to the east or west, the other houses could be $100,000 more. But yet the reality is, although maybe it's illegal now and it doesn't exist as much, it really still does exist. I know where my house is located now, right across from Sunny Slope High School, because it's across Dunlap to the north. I'm in a not so good area, and white people are always quick to tell me that I live in a bad neighborhood. In whatever ways, And then when I came out here and I was looking for a home, knowing that the challenges of getting approved for a loan, we went extra cheap, bottom line cheap, to find something. And people kept saying, well, you don't want to live in this area or that area. And I was thinking to them, I just want to buy a house so I'm not renting, and I'm going to get a house wherever it is that I can get it. And I know, just because how I've grown up, I know where I have to go to get a loan. And when I worked for Wells Fargo Bank, because I was in the system, I was easily able to get my first condo because I worked for Wells Fargo Bank. And so there was some security there, in their confidence of me. And so my first condo I was able to buy at age 22 by myself in Long Beach, California, 4 blocks from the beach. But I was a part of the system, so it made a little bit of a difference.
Thanks, Kim. How about you, Miguel?
2 things. The first example that I can think of would just, if anybody came up to me and asked me, where can I get some? Just look at the news, for crying out loud. I mean, when you look at this kid in Kenosha, Wisconsin, that literally just shot 3 people, killing 2 of them, and walks up with the same rifle he just committed his crime with, right up to the cops, giving himself up, and they pass by him. What would have happened if it would have been a person of color? What would have happened if it would have been a black man with the rifle going to the same place?
Right.
That would have ended in a completely different story. But nonetheless, that is white privilege. Then I think the other example that I have is I look at the disparity, and we have been in discussions actually in our denomination, the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America. Actually, it's very, very white. I don't want to give the exact percent. I think it's like 98% white. And so that being said, there's a huge disparity, especially when it comes to the financial compensation of pastors, especially pastors of color. because most of the time our pastors of colors are pegged to communities of color, which a lot of them happen to be most of the time in impoverished areas. And so it's not that they don't get opportunities to be in white congregations. It's just that for some way or one reason or another, I think systemically, that we just get stuck in those situations. So when you look at the comparison of a pastor about the same amount of time, but you look at their compensation, even if it's in the same city, oftentimes there's a huge disparity, even though it's the same experience and the same amount of ministry experience. And so so when I hear people say, "Where is this white privilege at?" I'm like, "Come on!" I mean, it's not that difficult to see. I mean, unless you are seriously blind. But again, this example in Wisconsin, I mean, for crying out loud, it is perfect. As when I looked at that kid walking up to all these cops and nothing, and they just drove by him, and their excuse was, "Oh, somebody got hurt. Where are they at?" I'm like, "Why isn't this kid on his knees? Why isn't this kid being arrested?" I just cannot. I don't understand.
Wow. So do we have any more questions right now? That David, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask our panelists in particular, with the different experiences you've had with particularly white privilege and the blindness to white privilege, and the defensiveness about white privilege.
Yes.
What would you guys recommend as a strategy for those of us who are the beneficiaries of white privilege to work on? I know we're never going to be cured of it. It's like racism or alcoholism. We're only going to ever be in recovery. But maybe some examples of some aha moments that people have had, maybe some ways that you could recommend.
I'll start.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Thank you. I have a mentor, a white male who I worked with years ago, who in corporation really saved my rear end, because he was a VP and he saw that I was being treated differently. And so he got wind of the fact that, I was going to be moved, or I was going to be demoted, or whatever. And he really stood up for me. And I am so grateful for that. And so that was maybe 12 years ago. And now fast forward to now, we keep in touch. And somehow we got on the conversation about white fragility. And I thought he was going to be open because he was so good to me, and saved me. But it was just such a awkward discussion, because he did listen to Robin DiAngelo on YouTube. So I give him credit for that. But the defensiveness just blew me away, just totally shocked me. But what I found is, at least, and that's where I guess we know who we can talk to, or at least who has some hope, some possibility. So I just started to point a few things out to him. He still was defensive, but I could at least see that he was listening. So for me, at least, it was just more of a small feeding of examples, and to a receptive party. And the same thing happened with a white friend, a female friend, who also was similarly taken aback and in total denial. But once she stopped, and it was like 2 weeks later, then she brought up the conversation again. So I don't know that I'm offering advice other than it's almost a matter of giving small chunks of examples and hoping that these individuals can see it. Because like you said, for most white people, they're totally oblivious to that.
Takes time to sink in.
Yeah. And if they're not oblivious, it's hard to give away that power. It's hard to give away that privilege. It comes as an inconvenience, right?
That's because it's not seen as power. It's just the world the way it is.
Right. Yeah. I was going to say my story was kind of similar to yours. When I was in my first appointment, there's a lot of things that were going on that were going wrong. I don't want to get into specifics, but except for to say that I began to have the conversation about white privilege. And my supervisor at that time got super defensive. And instead of us being able to talk as colleagues, as me as his associate pastor, he instead went to another Black employee, who actually a mixed employee, who kind of sided with him. And it just continued to make my time there very, very difficult, because I was seen as being the one to bring up the issue of race when there was no racism in this particular congregation. So I haven't had very many encounters with people who have had aha moments. I think I have good people in my corner, like David Felten and a few others, white males in my conference, that have been able, that know better, and so they do better, and they provide opportunities for folks like myself to grow and to learn and to be a part of things such as this.
So there's a couple of things that when you talked about white privilege, I keep memories of conversations that I've had recently, actually, keep coming up. I had to get to a point where I was talking. I don't remember who I was talking to. Doesn't really matter. But there was the only way that they wanted to find out. They wanted to be woke. I get it. They wanted to find out more about the issue, but the only way that they could figure out how was by reading a book. And I had to stop and say, look, dealing with this issue is not a head thing. Okay, you're not gonna learn how to be woke because you read something. I said, dealing with this issue is a hard thing. You need to walk in somebody's shoes. You need to hear their story. You need to hear their pain, so you can begin to realize that this is real. This is not made up, and you can begin to understand that maybe you have similar experiences, but the reality is that you have very vastly different experiences, and you have had so much privilege that you just, you might not be able to see, but once you hear somebody else's story, you might be able to. So it's a heart issue. It's not a head issue. Let's stop reading books. Not that we want, an ignorant society, but let's have a hard conversation. Let's get to know each other. Let's break bread together.
Yes.
Right? Where we can gather around a table and be able to tell the story of our ancestors, and be able to reach into each other's hearts and get to know each other better.
Yeah.
And I guess as you're, go ahead. I'm sorry, John.
No, Kimberly, go.
Okay. I was just thinking, since everything has happened, in the last several months, I have had some really good opportunities to have conversations in ways I never thought I'd be able to. I challenged my congregation to what's called a 21-day race and equity challenge. And it was, the first 21 days was incredible. But since that time, every Sunday, we've continued to watch some sort of video or listen to some type of podcast that is in that 21-day challenge in the queue that we can, also that we can discuss. And that has been, I think that has been really eye-opening, not for just the people, my congregants, but also for me, because I've been able to learn a lot of good history and make sense of things that I didn't really understand before. And I also had a chance to facilitate that 21-day challenge with over at the Fountains, thanks to David. And so those have been very positive experiences. And as we go forward, our whole conference will be taking that 21-day challenge beginning in October.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. What I want to do is ask each and every one of you to either provide us with resources where people who genuinely want to know more about this, want to learn more about, when especially people who are not aware of what white privilege looks like, and how the consequences of racism has affected Asian Americans and African Americans and Hispanic Americans and Native Americans for generations, not just now, not in this day and age, but it's been going on for, grandfather and grandmother and all the way down for 5-6 generations. If you have resources that you can share, obviously you won't be able to do it online right now, but please send it to me, send it to David or John, and we will make sure we put it on the Islamic Speakers Bureau of Arizona resource page so that it's available for everyone. Things that you think will be useful, podcasts, articles, anything that you think will be useful, great. With that, I'm going to ask John and David to take us to a close and invite you all to give us a couple of seconds of whatever you wish to say.
Yeah, I just, in a nutshell, want to say for Miguel, Janice, and Kimberly, hearing your stories, Miguel, to your point, if we, and this is the name of this, Azra, right? This is listening, is critical and essential. And then to be able to hear, as you've all offered examples, as allies, how we actually can begin to change systemic racism, and what are those areas where we can, we can be allies to others, or recruit allies for ourselves, and that action step should not be lost on anybody.
And I would just like to close up by not only saying thank you to all of our panelists, and again, regrettably, Nez Perry not able to join us, but a big thank you to Azra Hussain and the folks at the Islamic Speakers Bureau of Arizona for organizing these conversations, and for Joe. You can't see Joe or hear Joe. Maybe Joe would say hello. Hello, Joe. Who is making all of the technology happen in the background. Hey, there you go, Joe. So thank you so much for everybody who's taken time out of their busy lives to share on this really important topic. And I hope that you will join us again. The 2 previous episodes are on the Islamic Speakers Bureau of Arizona YouTube channel. This one will be archived on that channel so you can share it with your networks. And if you have any ideas for future conversations, we're continuing to develop them and look forward to doing this every 6 weeks or so. And so we look forward to seeing you at the next Real Change Begins With You conversation. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Good night.
Thanks, everybody.
Good night.
Miguel, thanks, brother.